Welcome to the Christ Central Devotional. You're joining us towards the end of chapter 6 of the book of Mark in our series through the book of Mark. Happy Monday. In the UK, we've had a very wet and wild weekend. Heavy weather events, not just in the UK. A lot of Europe has copped it, perhaps even worse than we did. But we're coming to a passage where weather events feature centrally. So I'm now going to take us into the passage and I'm going to put it up on the screen. And we are going to see this. Go back. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving them, he went up on a mountain to pray. The previous passage to this, which must be mentioned because of the linkage of this immediately, is the feeding of over 5,000 men. We don't get much of the details of what was said to these 5,000 men, and in some translations of the Bible, it suggests that their families were with them as well. So it was a crowd of even bigger than 5,000 potentially. But you get the impression with this very strong word immediately that before the end, before the crowd have been dispersed, Jesus bundles the disciples almost rudely into the boat and says essentially, row towards Bethsaida. And then he's the one who finishes things off with the crowd, disperses them. We're in a passage which may not look like it just at the moment, but is one of the most challenging passages in the whole of the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to find out why. It's quite disturbing on a number of fronts, as well as difficult quite to work out how it works. After leaving them, both the crowd and the disciples who are in the boat, we'll come back to them in a minute, Jesus goes up on the mountainside to pray. Later that night, so Jesus has been praying on the mountainside for some time. The boat was in the middle of the lake, and he, Jesus, was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. We've not finished this passage yet. There's some more, and we'll get to that. But I just want to get you to have a look at this. Sea of Galilee, Bethsaida, and where we're going to see the boat come to land, Gennesaret. A couple of miles. The odd thing, and here's one of the challenges for this particular passage, the odd thing is that the feeding of the 5,000, as far as we can best discern, happened quite close to Bethsaida, where the red arrow is putting just to the west of Bethsaida. That's where it's most likely this feeding of the 5,000 could have and would have taken place. So when Jesus dismisses the disciples, sends them to the boat, and says pretty much row towards Bethsaida, they're kind of already there potentially. They go into a boat, immediately they're hit by an offshore breeze, and they are in rowing practice. And I don't know if any of you have ever been rowers, But rowing is pretty intense. And he goes up, he dismisses the 5,000 or the 5,000 plus. He goes up a mountain, he prays for most of the night, and near dawn, he then observes still the disciples still in the boat hours and hours later, who are still rowing against the wind. In fact, by the time he is looking at them, we'll find that they are very near to Gennesaret. They've been going backwards the whole time. The wind has been that strong. So he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake, walking on the water. He was about to pass them by. Very easy little phrase just to kind of, but what does that mean? This is a phrase reminiscent, and it should be reminiscent, of passages in the Old Testament, and we see a couple when God passes by people. Most famously and most evocatively, Moses, where Moses is put in a cleft in the rock, and he's allowed to see, if you like, God's back. God passes by Moses. It's not the only occasion, but it's that thing that should be brought into your mind. That phrase should be leaping to your mind. There's something of the divine here. And yet when they saw him, their reaction is really quite strange, or perhaps not, if they spent all night rowing, going backwards in a boat, and actually they don't know that they're going to see the land. It's probably got to the point where they are exhausted, beside themselves, and they cry out because they all saw him, and they are, and again, this is a theme, a motif in Mark's gospel. They see Jesus, they're not reassured, they're not happy, they're not delighted, they're not thinking, oh wow, this is the second time. We saw him back in chapter 4. He was walking on the water at that point, and then he calmed the storm. Hooray, this is what's going to happen. They are terrified. They think he's dead. Why would they even think that? How could they go from feeding of 5,000 to thinking that Jesus is dead in a night? Well, maybe if you'd been in a severe weather event, rowing, getting nowhere, going backwards for hours and hours and hours, maybe the context of being terrified actually works there. Now we finish off the passage. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, the wind died down, and they were completely amazed. For they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region, carried the sick on mats wherever they heard he was, and wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick on the market, in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Well, we have shifted our focus, haven't we? We've gone away from where the boat is and what any of that might have meant, and we've gone to this amazing, complete sets of healings going on around that region of Gennesaret. But let's go back into the boat. Immediately he spoke to them. Don't be afraid, take courage. And then in this little passage where Jesus speaks, in that central part, he says, "It is I." If Jesus walking past the boat, as it were, on the water, passing by, is perhaps a pointer towards something of the divine, something of God's presence, then a bigger alarm bell than even that phrase has just been detonated in this gospel. That little phrase, "it is I," in Greek, ego eimi, I am, is exactly the phrase translation used in the Old Testament in Exodus when Moses at the burning bush says, "You've got to give me a name. I've got to know your name. I can't go with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Tell me a name." And God says, "I am. It is I." And Jesus, in the midst of their terror, says, "Take courage, Yahweh. Don't be afraid." And then he climbs into the boat with them, and the wind suddenly drops, and they are completely amazed. They hadn't understood what had happened at the feeding of the 5,000. Their hearts were hardened. In Mark's gospel, there's never an occasion when the disciples are away from Jesus that they don't find themselves in disarray, something goes wrong. This is another one of those episodes. And you can be a disciple of Jesus and not understand what's going on, how God is at work, what's he want from you. Even the reassurance can be confusing. So my final thought, and here we come into land for us, is not on this occasion about the miracles, is not the healings, is not the amazing things of the what was going on with the 5,000. It's this thing that even as believers, we can get to this place where we somehow take the things of God for granted. We don't actually know enough to be faithful, and we can still experience terror. We can be amazed at God. There's a phrase which doesn't come from Mark's gospel, it comes from John's gospel, where Jesus says to the disciples in a different setting, "Without me, you can do nothing." But it's the phrase that I want to finish us today with, as a reminder, as an encouragement, as a challenge. Without me, you can do nothing. How are we doing? It's Monday morning. We've had a severe weather weekend. We can end up doing our own thing in life and using the following of Jesus as a pastime, a hobby, a weekend activity, a sort of what we do when we're not preoccupied by real life. Following Jesus is the main event that everything else hinges around. Even as believers, sometimes we need to be reminded. And sometimes it is the rudeness of the cataclysm of the life around us that makes us focus on the fact that without him, we can truly do nothing.